12:15. So we'll continue to let folks come in from the weight room, but I'm gonna turn off my video and mute myself, and I'm gonna turn the program over to Janine and Father Dan.
Thank you, Christine, and welcome everyone this morning. After all these years of presenting our restorative justice conferences in person, this has been certainly a different experience, but I'm thrilled that so many of you have turned in this morning, and some of you and others have turned in during the week. We've had a great turnout for our various presentations, and feel free to send us emails after the fact on how you liked it. At least kept us socially distanced as we engaged in this conference. For those of you who might not know me, as you heard, my name is Janine Geske. I am retired as a full-time faculty member at Marquette Law School. I am, however, teaching a course this semester, and I'm on the Board of Trustees at Marquette. I also have run the Restorative Justice Initiative at the law school for, I think, at least 15 years. And we have been doing these conferences, I think, about that long. And we have picked a different topic every year. And this year, we decided to focus a little bit on sort of restorative justice and our own personal journeys, how it affects us and how it affects those close to us. Rather than always focusing on outward issues, including we've done race, we've done bullying, we've done international harm, and a variety of topics. So this has been a little bit of a different approach, but it turned out that it seemed like an appropriate approach considering all the anxiety and tough life we're leading with both our politics and our health. And so I'm glad you're able to join us. Joining me in this discussion this morning is a very, very dear friend of mine, Father Dan Griffith. If you didn't hear from Dan earlier in the week, Dan is a pastor. He's a diocesan priest up in the Minneapolis-St. Paul diocese. He's the pastor at Our Lady of Lourdes, downtown Minneapolis. He also is a faculty member, holds a distinguished position at St. Thomas Law School and teaches restorative justice. Dan also, among many other things, is been appointed the restorative justice connection between the Archdiocese and the various parishes, and is going out into parishes and talking about restorative justice. Dan and I became friends about 4 years ago when we started doing some work up in Minneapolis. And if you have questions about that, I'll be happy to talk about. But we've been working intensively at dealing with the issues of clergy abuse in Minneapolis, and working with parishes and working with survivors and working with people in the Archdiocese. And as a result, we have done both specific work and a lot of teaching. What we thought we'd do this morning, we advertised, is that we would answer questions that you have, and if there's a break in the questions, we've got plenty we can talk about. I think that let's take our 4 questions that we had going in, I think, at the beginning. Dan, if you want to add anything about yourself and your work, feel free. But one of the first questions we had was the relationship between probation and parole agents and restorative justice. And I know that you've had some discussions in your classes about those issues. So if you want to share your perceptions on that issue and anything else you want to add at this point.
Great. Thanks, Janine. And thank you to Christine and all of the folks who have put on this wonderful conference. It's great to be with all of you. As Janine mentioned in the really wonderful interview, similar to her experience, I find restorative justice to be a gift really to promote healing, but also a gift personally, which is part of what the focus of the conference is. And I noted in my talk that it has made me a better pastor, a better listener, and I think open the heart, to compassion and accompaniment. And it's been a great gift to become close friends with Janine and Mike. And Janine's a terrific mentor, as I said. And I learn something every time she talks and presents, including in the interview that she did. And in the Powerful Circle, I happened to be there in person when that was taped. And I watched it again this morning, and it's just extraordinary. I know Penny's with us. To see that pain and trauma, and then the folks, all three, Ron and LT and Penny, approach it from a place of faith and gratitude and humility. It just shows the power of restorative justice. So it's a gift for me to be involved in this work. So on the question, both Janine and I and our friend and colleague Hank Shea teach law students restorative justice, and we've seen the power of restorative practices for law students. This is not your typical experience in law school to have moments of vulnerability. You're usually trying to compete and do as best you can, but we've seen law students really respond to restorative practices in a powerful way. So in our course that Hank Shea and I teach, we bring in folks who have been in the criminal justice system as perpetrators. I know there's other words that people use as well to describe those folks who are part of the criminal justice and now are out and trying to live a life of flourishing. And one of the things that we see, and it's a really good question, I think, by Edward Byrne, is that it really depends on the type of parole or probation officer. And it really runs the gamut. You hear some of these folks talk about really great experiences. In fact, we had one person who was both a victim of clergy abuse and then went on and he had offended in the criminal justice system. And he tells two vastly different stories about a probation officer, one who clearly had his best interest in mind. I know he's coming from his own perspective, and then one who had seemingly put up roadblocks at every step, and that was really frustrating. One thing I would say, and then Janine, I'm sure, has a comment, the use of restorative practices as a alternative path. So you could see it within the criminal justice system when people are already in prison or in jail, but you can also see increasingly the opportunity to use restorative practices as an alternative path to the formal criminal justice system. The fellow in Ramsey County, John Choi, has been using restorative practices, including recently in some really creative ways. But I think you could also see an alternative path in terms of parole and probation. What if there were opportunities for circles? And so you move outside of the normal parole process or probation process and utilize restorative practices to really help people get a sense of the harm that might have come from crime, the impact on victim survivors, and an opportunity to really approach a life that is more, I think, more onto human flourishing and taking responsibility. So I think there is some potential there, but it requires people, county attorneys and others, who are willing to think outside of the box. And again, as John Choi says, to think beyond the kind of baked in sorts of things that, well, we've always done it that way, so it's just too hard to figure out another way. So that would be kind of my response.
I'm just going to add that some of you may remember that the law school was involved in circles in the community for about 4 years, a number of years ago, where we were working particularly with men and women who were being released from prison, many of whom were gang members. And we were holding circles in the community, including police officers and survivors of crime and neighbors and probation and parole agents and a variety of other people. And I can tell you that in some of those circles where the agents were invested and interested, it was really good discussion, one, for them to hear the stories of the various men and women who've been released from prison, but just as importantly for them to hear the agents talk about how they put their heart and soul into a particular individual when they're released from prison, want him or her to succeed, do everything they can to make the path a wide one for them, and what it feels like when that individual goes out and commits a new crime. It's another ripple that happens, and how those agents, they find their hearts getting harder as they have more and more, as they call them, failures, or people who have committed crimes who then go out and commit other crimes. On the other hand, you know, for everybody to hear the stories, it often helped both law enforcement officers and those agents to hear the men and women to tell their personal stories, their journeys. And often it's the first time that those people in authority have heard an offender tell those stories. And that can make a bridge to a restorative path. So I am a big believer in it. It's a matter of getting probation and parole agents, as Dan said, the ones who are interested in becoming invested. I'm going to just touch on the next question, which was from Leah Seeley. And it wasn't really a question, it was a discussion of a story that she had heard when she was in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps of a situation where there had been great harm and I think a homicide, and how the village was dealing with the homicide. And one of the traditions was that the offender would actually move in with the victim's family for a year, and the victim's family and the offender would have to, you know, learn to live with each other and understand each other. And that was one way of bringing that community back together when there aren't many ways. And the story I was going to add was probably over 10 years ago, I was in Lagos, Nigeria, speaking about restorative justice. And I had a Jesuit priest come up to me who was from the States, but he was a pastor at a really large parish in Lagos. And he was telling me the story of a young man in the parish who had sexually assaulted a young woman on church property. And the families not only were divided, but the community was divided. There was a lot of anger and hurt. And he said to me, the authorities have decided not to prosecute. Is there anything we could do restoratively to help with this division in the church? Gave him the brief talk about restorative justice and victim offender dialogue and preparing witnesses. And I said, what I'm about to tell you would never work in the United States for a variety of reasons. But let me just suggest that you may want to talk to the parties about it. Talk to the victim and the victim's family and find out whether they are interested in having a dialogue with the young man and his family, to have a chance to ask him questions, a chance to tell him the harm that was caused. And if they're willing to have that dialogue and discussion, then to approach the young man and his family and see if he would be willing to have that discussion. So we emailed back and forth as he prepared the parties who were interested. And he described the meeting while they talked through the crime. And apparently the young man fell to his knees in front of the victim and her family, apologizing and weeping for what he had done and asking for forgiveness. And the family was very moved. Her family was very moved. And they talked it through, and they eventually came to a conclusion that he would be banned from certain parish activities. And, you know, there are things that wouldn't seem like much to us, but it was enough that the survivor and her family were pleased, and it was going to bring the people back together. And the priest said, you know, it really was a success in terms of the parish. So there are lots of different uses of restorative justice. And often it's a matter of figuring out what might fit culturally in a particular situation, and make sure somebody who's very sensitive to the cultural issues and hopefully even part of the community participating in it.
And I would just add real quickly that one of the things that Janine does that I've learned is how important the preparation is for that sort of dialogue. It really requires a lot of thought, sensitivity to culture, and a lot of pre-dialogue. The other thing I would say with that story, Janine, I would interview Janine for a law journal article that's coming out, and she conveyed that story, and it's one of those moments, and she referred to this in her interview, where it's an awe moment, where you either hear the story or you witness it live in a circle, and you can't help but think, and from a faith perspective, that this is God working in the here and now in a very, very powerful way. And that's why people who do this work, this really, it's a ministry. It's very humbling, because you see that power in the moment in a way that's really transformative.
And let me add, as Dan and I talk about this, it is very much a spiritual moment for us, but we are also careful not to put our own faith, our own spirituality in the middle of the event. It is really up to the parties to conclude and to see what is happening. And all agree that it was miracle-like or mystical, or use different words. And, it has nothing to do with us evangelizing. It has everything to do with giving parties an opportunity to share their stories and to find some healing in the process. Another question, Dan, I'll let you answer this. Someone asked about learning how to ask questions in the circle. And I know you're newer to this than I am, but what have you learned, or what do you find helpful when you're doing a circle in terms of what the question is you ask the people who are participating?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I've learned from you is that and you reaffirm this in your interview, to ask it broadly enough, a question broadly enough that everybody can respond. I also think it's helpful, and you've demonstrated this as well, to, you and I are maybe not the biggest people on all the icebreaker stuff. Some of our colleagues maybe more so, but maybe that's the lawyer in each of us. But the asking a question that gets folks comfortable, you had mentioned the one, talk about somebody who's been there for you at a difficult moment. They did this down in Chicago during our training as well. And it allows us to enter into the circle in a way that's a little more comfortable. And then, oftentimes the more challenging questions come. So I would ask it broadly enough, and then the first questions to be comfortable enough where everybody can enter in. And then as they see the dynamic open up, and you had mentioned too, having somebody on your right or left who is going to share deeply, that sets the tone. And it's amazing the cascading of real openness and vulnerability that happens once somebody leads off in that way.
Yeah, and one of the things, when you're dealing, for example, with children, it's a different approach. And some of you know my dear friend Ron Johnson, who ran circles for me on the north side of Milwaukee for a long time, and worked with gang members and trying to get gang members comfortable in sharing things. And so he would ask, his first question would be for everybody to name their favorite breakfast. And it seems kind of funny, but they had fun, kind of, their Cocoa Puffs or whatever their cereals were, and just to get them comfortable with telling their stories. When Dan talks about asking broad enough, when I was doing the community circles with people who were living and breathing violence in terms of their own lives and their neighbors and the community and the police, I would ask, the broad question I would ask is, can you share a story that would illustrate how violence has impacted your life? And people can go they can talk about, being scared in a moment of violence, or they can talk about where they live as a result of violence. And the one thing that's helpful in that question is to go through, as a facilitator, to go through, at least if you can, quickly 10 different examples that are all different from each other. Because if you just ask the question, the first person will answer it and the rest of the room will follow the same train of thought. And so you want to give people a chance to have different ideas. So I tell people, you know, whatever pops into your mind, go with it. Don't start thinking, oh, that story isn't good enough, this story isn't good enough. But you have to make sure when you're asking that question that everybody can answer it. So when in prison, I don't ask, tell an experience, you know, of you being in prison. That would shut out half my room when I was doing the prison work. And so, or, you know, talk about your parents. Well, half the room may not have two parents. And so, it takes some time to think about the right question that's going to make everyone feel comfortable. There was one more question, and then we'll see if there are any in the chat room, but it was a question about training and how you become more experienced in this. And I can only mention a couple of things. And Dan, I don't know if you have anything going on in the Twin Cities. One of the restorative justice programs that's existed in Milwaukee, and I'm guessing it's close to 20 years, is the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office. They have run a community conferencing program for a very long time. And they handle cases out of the DA's office. They are often bringing community members in, and they're training both community members for the circle and facilitators. And they provide that training in exchange for a commitment to provide some services to them for those services. And that's been very successful. And they're very meaningful circles because it really consists of community members, both talking about the impact of the particular crime, but also talking about the path to restoration and what they think might be helpful for the perpetrator to do. The second organization I just want to mention in Milwaukee is the Zeidler Group, or the Zeidler Foundation. Zeidler, as you know, was one of our socialist mayors in Milwaukee and was a true believer in community-based activities. And if you go to Zeidler on the web, you will see that they generally offer training and facilitation and some of this work. A lot of it's been on hold because of the coronavirus. There are some national programs that are doing some training on the web, and you can look into it. Catholic Mobilizing provides some training, which is a national organization out of Washington, D.C. And there are some others that do it. So you can look. There is an International Association of Community and Restorative Justice, which is a resource of information, and their website probably has training too. I don't know if you have any other ideas on that, Dan.
Yeah, in the cities, we have Minnesota Peace Building Leadership Institute. They do some training as well. And what we've seen is there's usually kind of two levels of training. There's kind of a more basic training where you can get an idea of the ins and outs of circles, where you could lead, you could lead a basic circle. And then there's a more intensive training that's usually 3 to 4 days that I would really, ask people to look into if they're wanting to do more intensive circle work, because there's a ton of stuff that you learn. Of course, you don't know what you don't know, and you learn based on the experience of what works and what doesn't. And so we were down in Chicago a year and a half ago, or about a year and a half ago, and it was a 4-day intensive, and it was really, really helpful. And I would not have felt comfortable, Hank, who's on the call, we've certainly learned through Janine and others, and through experience with our law students. And that's the way you learn best, through experience. But those are a couple that come to mind.
We have a question in the chat room, Dan, about what is the best restorative correction for a circle participant who keeps giving out advice. In the circle that I shared in day 2, there was a chance to react as the last round. How about the participant who, and I think I've lost the rest of that question. There's another question, maybe we can combine them, dealing about when you've decided a circle would not be helpful in a particular situation, and what do you see as red flags? Both excellent questions. So Dan, you and I have encountered circles, particularly in parishes, where people want to give out advice and want to control the dialogue and really kind of take it off in another direction. How do you handle that?
Kind of dialectically between being firm and being clear, and not, being clear, but also you have to have a gentleness to the degree that delivers a message and brings people back to, what we agreed upon. So you're getting buy-in in a sense when you explain what goes on in a circle. You're informing them, but you're also kind of laying out, these are the ground rules. And so we certainly have had those folks in a circle. We often have folks who want to try to fix things. They want to talk from their head rather than their heart. We can't necessarily control that, but when people are either giving out advice or, asking clarifying questions or interrupting, we have to go back to this is a safe space. This is a sacred space. And it really works when somebody is holding that piece, that it's their time to tell their story, and to remind them of that, and that we're not directly responding with advice, but rather listening. And that's the way we demonstrate, compassion and our connection in the circle, is by listening attentively and respectfully.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and Dan was inferring this, is that every time you have something like that go wrong, your introduction gets a little longer next time, because it's something you're going to include and say, you may have a tendency to want to give advice to somebody in the circle, but that really is not the role of the circle. It's to tell your own personal story. And really, my introduction has gotten longer and longer and longer during the years for things that have gone wrong. It really is a goal for the facilitator not to intervene if he or she cannot. I mean, you really don't want to intervene, because you do change the whole tenor of how it's handling. And actually, people will react to somebody going off track in the subsequent discussions. But there are times, an example would be, and I don't want to put anybody sort of in a class, but I will. There were a couple of African-American preachers who would come to my circles, and I absolutely adore them, but they like to preach. And rather than sort of reflect a personal story, they would rather preach. And a couple of times, I would pull them aside before we started, because I knew this was an issue with them, and tried to gently tell them that really they've had such rich experiences that would be helpful in the circle for them to share those experiences versus preaching to the group. A couple of times that wasn't enough. And if the minister really went off and was really preaching, I might gently interrupt and said, Reverend Jones, I appreciate, your comments, but can you tell us a story about how you've experienced that, and try to nudge them back into place. So a lot of it, it's funny, because as a facilitator, on the one hand, you have to be very relaxed and present, and the other, you're sitting at the edge of your chair trying to anticipate what might happen and making sure a survivor isn't hurt or something bad doesn't happen. And so it's that tension of trying to look relaxed, be relaxed, but yet do that. And that comes with a lot of experience. I mean, the more you do, the more you get used to it. The second part of the question, I'll answer, then I'll have Dan answer it. The whole question of when there may be red flags of not doing a circle. And this is a good point, because we've not talked about this. Circles can be used for lots of different purposes. They can be, the circles we were doing in the parish were in part just to have a community discussion about the clergy abuse scandal. It might be a circle to deal with crime in a particular neighborhood. It might deal with something that's going on at work, you know, an unhealthy work environment and things that are going on. That can be a little more general. And, you know, even when schools use a circle for bullying, teachers try not to identify somebody as the bully, but in fact, ask everybody to share a story when they felt bullied. And so you're not picking anybody out as the offender. On the other hand, you can have circles that deal with a very specific instance. And you have clearly somebody who may be put in that classification of instigator or perpetrator, and the other one in the instance of victim, although with kids, it's often a little of both. And there it's very directed. And, you know, Dan mentioned the preparation. If you're going to do a circle on one event with individuals, that takes as much preparation as it does with a victim offender dialogue. You got to spend time with those parties. You got to make sure that they're going to be open to things, to listen, not to yell, not to argue, you know, and that you're going to feel comfortable. And a lot of it is gut work, like a lot of mediation. Do you feel comfortable that this is in the room of working? And if you don't think so, my feeling is always that I don't do it. So, Dan?
Yeah, I would add that in that, I agree with you that intuition is a big part of it. I think that it's helpful if facilitators of restorative justice are intuitive by, you know, nature, if that's a gift that they have, because you have to be able to read the situation in a way that relies on instinct and kind of, you know, gauging body language, that sort of thing. As Janine said, the prep work is absolutely key. The other thing that's helpful is to have a partner. So, you know, if you're doing facilitation and you have two people and you know the other person well, you know, so Julie and Paul are on the call. Hank, you know, these are all colleagues I know well. They're all friends, and obviously Janine. And so being able to bounce ideas off of each other and say, you know, this is kind of what I'm thinking, that this may not be appropriate for these reasons. And then to have a colleague, you know, say, yeah, you know, I think you're right. I think that's helpful as well. But it really requires that preparation and I think a thoughtful approach.
So Dan, let me ask you, this has been a big week in sort of hierarchical Catholic circles with the report coming out on Cardinal McCarrick and who knew what at the Vatican and at lower levels, and reopens a lot of those issues on clericalism and what's happened historically in terms of the sex abuse in the church, and how can we possibly move forward. And so I've heard you talk on these topics. Would you be willing to share a perspective on what's happening? Yeah,
thank you. And you know, there may be a number of folks on the Zoom call who are Catholic, and you know, those of us who are Catholic, there's basically, you know, four kind of different areas of harm. You know, you've got the political polarization, racial injustice, you've got the clergy sex abuse and attendant cover-up, which are often described as the twin crises. And then you've got COVID, you know, and one of the things that Janine and I have talked about is the ability of restorative justice and restorative practices to really deal with harm in those various areas. The church, and this is church hierarchy, you know, struggles significantly with a lack of credibility because of past and in some cases current significant mistakes or injustices or a lack of prudential judgment. And I think all of that was on display in the McCarrick report. I give Pope Francis and Cardinal Parolin credit, and those who worked on it is very thoroughgoing. John Allen has a really interesting piece out in Crux where he says the genie's now out of the bottle here. that no longer can it be the playbook of secrecy and we're going to declare sovereignty and focus on the institution. But this was more of a turn to a more victim-centered response, including interviewing a number, I think 17 victim survivors in the report. What I think we see, Janine and others, and this is one of the things that I've been talking about, and this came out of sabbatical research and prayer, is it really comes back to the culture. It comes back to church culture and the fact that it's a clerical culture, and it's afflicted by clericalism and an insular culture. And you see that right through the entire document. I don't know if the folks who were writing it and those, the Vatican people were seeing that, but it's all through the document. The fact that you believed Cardinal McCarrick without further investigation. The fact that there was a decision to appeal to his conscience. This is a person, I think it's priest number 3, they refer to who he was credible. Well, at that point, you've got real questions about a lack of a lively conscience on the part of then Cardinal McCarrick, or we appeal to his ecclesial spirit. Well, there's no evidence showing that there is an ecclesial spirit. He's a good fundraiser and he had a magnetic personality, but he was a deeply, deeply flawed and wounded and unjust person. So what I think you see is a number of areas where the church lacked objectivity. It lacked internal controls. So there's the evidence that Pope John Paul II might have been influenced by what was happening in Poland, where during his time they would put out false information with regard to priests. Well, maybe those cultural experiences and even biases were part of the story in terms of why they didn't believe this or further investigated or just relied on Cardinal McCarrick. Well, then you have to have internal checks and balances that basically check that sort of thing, so you can further get to the truth of the matter. Now, today, if an allegation came out with regard to a priest, virtually in every diocese, it would be handled in a much more systematic way, with objectivity, notwithstanding still cultural challenges in terms of church culture. But until we reform the culture of the church, we're going to continue to see, and people, Catholic lay people say rightly and in a dismayed way, well, why are we going to we just keep hearing these things time after time? Well, until we change the culture and reform the culture, we're going to continue seeing this, might be in the financial area or others. So that would be kind of my quick take on the thing. And I would be really interested to hear what Janine thinks about this.
Ditto. No, I think you're right. It's a complex problem, and it's not going to be fixed by simply looking at a victim and offender, but looking at the whole systems and ways of addressing the systems, because the systems culturally are out of whack that have allowed this to happen and continue to happen. And I'm not sure they're being addressed adequately at this point either. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. Dan, Hank asks a question about Dr. Yohuro Williams, who was at your parish last night and addressed racial justice issues from perspectives in restorative justice. Would you talk a little bit about that and what he had to say?
Sure. So one of the things that really struck me in the circle experience with LT and Ron and Penny is they all talked about racial justice, and you have as well in your interview. What was remarkable is they talked, I think it was LT who said when he saw the video of the killing of now I'm blanking on his name. We've had in the Twin Cities, somebody help me out here.
George Floyd.
Oh, George Floyd.
Yeah, sorry about that. That he literally, his breath was taken away. He had a hard time breathing. And one of the things that we've seen, I asked Dr. Williams the question, how do you see restorative justice and racial justice working? And he said they're inseparable. And he talked about both in terms of kids in school, children of color, students of color, who might get caught up either in disciplinary action, and that almost always predicts that they'll be in the either juvenile justice or criminal justice realm at some point, that the use of restorative practices in elementary school and in high school can be a really important way to have them tell their story, or to be able to deal with harm in a way that really lessens the chance that they'll end up in the criminal justice system. The other thing that it does, and this is what Dr. Williams said, is it allows people to tell their story. And when people, somebody like me who, went to law school, I was a white middle-class Catholic kid from Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin, which was really white at the time when I was growing up. Well, I had no experience. Well, when I went to law school a quarter century ago, I had a number of friends in our group of friends who were African American. They were Black, and it totally opened my eyes to their experience. Just having conversations, or when things occurred in law school. So Dr. Williams powerfully talked about, in the telling of the story, and that stories produce and harm speaks to a narrative that can be powerful. It also can be disturbing, because we have to face the injustices that are really systemic. And so I just see all sorts of utility and potential for restorative practices with regard to racial justice, to really enlighten folks, open our eyes to what the reality of our African American brothers and sisters, what they experience every day of their lives, which many of us have no idea of. And so I'm hopeful that this can really start a real movement, and I'm hopeful that it can be in places like the Twin Cities in Milwaukee, where we have seen, segregation, and we've seen harm, and we've seen real issues of injustice, and in a way that, we can be leaders in our particular communities.
The one thing, the only thing I'm going to add to that is what I tell my students often is that if people have an opportunity to tell their stories rather than ask questions or express opinions, you cannot argue with somebody's story. It is their story. And to have the benefit of kind of walking in their shoes as they tell their story can change your perspective on why they have the opinions they have, or why they may have taken the actions they have. And it's one of the important pieces of these circles is that, at least when you're doing the initial work, it's storytelling and not opinion telling. If you ask people's opinion, you'll get the diversity of opinion and arguments, and you don't get a connectedness that you get when people share a journey. Because when you share a journey, there are many people in the circle that have walked that same circle. One of the questions was, would you ever allow participants to ask a question either submitted before or during? I would not have somebody ask a question in the middle of a circle. Now, if they've voiced to me that they have some interest in some particular question, if I think it's appropriate, I may work it into the general question I ask. One of the things that we generally, and we haven't talked about this, end a circle that's an hour and a half, which is the general length of a community-based circle, 1.5 hours to 2 hours, is to do an evaluation and have people voice, what they enjoyed about the circle or what they were frustrated about with the circle and things. And that may give people an opportunity to generally ask the question. I would never allow a party in the circle to ask another party a question. That defeats the whole purpose of the talking piece and the sharing of the stories. And I just want to briefly answer another question: is how do you handle a circle in which someone gets very upset in process and are still upset when circle ends? That's tough. Part of it is your intro, talking about people might be triggered or upset during the circle. You invite people to step out if they feel that they would just as soon not be there for the moment or step out. And the circles we do on sexual abuse and other kinds of what I will call very hot button and triggering questions, we usually have a therapist or a psychologist or a counselor available to be there if somebody needs to run out of the room and talk. And I've learned that that's really, because that often happens. And we will tell the group that we have that person there and that they are willing to help if anybody has any questions. And I do think even the fact that there's somebody there helps people calm down, that they know that there's somebody that they can reach out to if they need to. And my view is, frankly, for most circles, if it's possible, that person ought to be paid. We're bringing them in as a professional. If you don't have any money and you can bring in a therapist who's willing to volunteer that time, that's certainly a good thing to do. It's better than having no one. But I do think that we have to professionalize this work, and it's important that someone be available. All right, I think maybe one last question, and then Dan has to go teach a class. Do you have time?
Yeah,
Dan?
Yep. I've got time.
How can RJ help us address these systemic issues and really create change at a systems level when we just saw an election where we see even greater divisiveness and clear resistance in the US? Okay, in 2 minutes or less, Dan, how are we going to fix that?
Great question. So a colleague of ours at St. Thomas, Amy Levad, who's written and spoken on restorative justice, she talks about the interplay between restorative justice and transformative justice, and how can restorative justice lead to really systemic change for the good. And I think it does begin with the stories, and it begins with it informing, and it really is about changing hearts and trying to get to a collective determination that we do have unjust structures that need to be transformed. So it's critical, but it's really hard work. I think one of the things that we can see, and Janine and I know this fellow colleague in this work, Dan Philpott out of Notre Dame, he's done the work of looking at how you can respond in a more global way, and kind of a truth and reconciliation model. So he's inviting a group of people to a conference in Notre Dame that'll probably be virtual, I think, this spring, to look at how you design a more global approach or a macro approach that uses restorative practices onto, more systemic change. And I think when we talk about political polarization and we talk about racial justice, one of the things that hasn't been done yet in Minnesota, which I certainly hope happens, is that we have a no holds barred, honest conversation that is a statewide conversation and led by African American leaders. And so there has to be a tipping point, and I think restorative justice is important, but I think it takes, and I'll end here, it takes determination, it takes thoughtfulness in terms of designing it, it takes buy-in from key people, and it definitely takes the power of story to the tipping point. One thing I'd say before we conclude is we'll get Christine a link to Dr. Yohuru's presentation. We also had a panel of 4 parishioners of color a couple weeks ago, and they did an extraordinary job telling their stories from a place of faith. So that would be my answer, but I think Janine deserves the last word.
Well, the only thing I'm just going to add is I just talked to Dan earlier this morning. We've been invited to do a presentation. Harvard's going to do a conference on, I think it's April 8th to 10th. It's going to be a virtual conference as well. And they're going to be addressing sort of the healing, interfaith healing, and looking at this issue globally. They're going to bring in people from Africa and different countries and to take a look at this work. I think that, there has so much work to be done, both one-on-one in small communities and interactions between people, but particularly the issues of the system issues, whether it's the racism, whether it's economic disparity, whether it's immigration status, whether it's all these issues are things that can benefit from people just listening to each other's stories and learning to find that we're all human, we're all part of this earth, and we're all part of the community, and we're best off when we're helping each other. I'm going to thank you all for participating. Hopefully we'll have a conference in a year or year and a half that we're all together, but I really appreciate all of you turning in and the great questions, and you can go back and watch the links and anybody wants. And if you have any questions, feel free to send any questions to Dan or I or to Christine, and she'll get them to us. So thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Janine. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and feel free to email me, and happy to help people. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Happy Thursday.
Thanks.